Jonathan Reed, and they talk a lot about the archaeology of the different areas in ways of interpreting what Paul may have encountered. And one of the things I thought was fascinating was they had discovered a number of synagogues in places, and archaeologists have a really tough time deciding whether it's a actual sort of Hebrew Jewish synagogue or a Samaritan synagogue, because they were so similar, but yet they would have been very distinct from one another at the time. But to outsiders, they look very similar.
Yeah, and I think there's one of many places where we have a lot of anxiety about that maybe the ancient world might not have had, right? Where we say, was it religious or was it not religious? Was it Jewish or Samaritan? Sometimes these lines were less important in the ancient world than they are to us, and we want clarity where it didn't really bother them that much.
That's a good point.
Sorry, Jill, we started without you.
It's after 7, so it is time to officially begin. So welcome everyone, and especially welcome Dr. Smith. And we'll just turn it right over to you, our last class, to finish up the book of Acts.
Great. Glad to be here with you, 21 faithful souls. I guess slightly more than 21 because there's a few people with more than one person in the room. I thought we would start this week like we started a couple weeks ago with just what we were just doing. So are there lingering thoughts that you had from last week or the week before, things you wanted to talk about before we launch into chapters 20 through 28 of Acts?
Did I really understand you to say that you thought Paul was a Unitarian Universalist?
I do. I think he's both a Unitarian and a Universalist, but I'm not sure he would have been on board with the Unitarian Universalists.
Today?
But maybe, So I think he's a Unitarian. I think we were having this discussion maybe 3 weeks ago about his language is always so theocentric. He always wants to center God's actions, and he doesn't think, Jesus rises from the dead. He thinks God raises Jesus. He doesn't think, Jesus is the one who brings salvation. He thinks God offers salvation through Jesus. So I think he's, living in a time before Christianity had hammered out anything like a doctrine of the Trinity. He does, I think Jesus is divine, but I don't think he would have been comfortable with Trinitarian language. So I think he would have, if we could put him in a time machine and beam him to 2021, I think he would describe himself in ways that we would recognize as Unitarian. And then the Universalist piece, I think as a good Jew, he understood that God was saving Israel, not Israelites, that God was in the business of being in covenant with a nation, a people, not individual people. And I think as he began to understand that had been extended to Gentiles, my sense is he had the same notion that salvation was offered not to individuals, but to people as a people group. And so I think he would have thought of God's saving work in something that we might recognize as a universalist framework.
I remember when I studied Old Testament and New Testament disciple classes and stuff, it seemed real obvious that in the Old Testament, God wasn't looking for individuals so much as the whole nation. But then Jesus seemed to be focusing on individuals.
There's something to that, I think, where Jesus does things like talk about the 99 and the one sheep, right? Where the one sheep is important. But Jesus also goes to, his first stop whenever he goes to a new town is whoever's been cast out. He goes to the leper on the corner, or the person who's not on the inside of that culture, that society. But I think what he's always up to there, like with the 99 and the one, what he's up to is reuniting the 100 with the village. He's up to putting that person back into community. So I think there's still a sense in which Jesus's work is holistic in the sense that he's trying to make things whole. He's thinking about the whole in a way that makes sense if you're a Jewish person in the first century. But I think you're right. There is a sense that that Jesus is more focused on people as individual persons. Be interesting to think through that, like in a paper or something, how that all plays out. Well, are we ready to jump in? All right. I'm sure you'll think of more comments and questions as we go. So I'm gonna, my dance by now, I'm gonna try to share my screen, and hopefully I will succeed. And then let's see, I've got to, here we go, play. Have I succeeded? Great. All right. So this week we are finishing the book of Acts, and the way that the book of Acts proceeds from the chapter 20 onward is really sort of a spiraling. It's sort of one of the metaphors I like, I can't remember if I used this before, is when a dancer, like a ballet dancer, is spinning, they draw their body in to spin faster, and that brings the motion more quickly. And I feel like that's kind of what Acts is up to at the end chapters, is things keep moving more and more quickly and more urgently, and so it sort of spirals toward Jerusalem and then ultimately toward the city of Rome. So we'll pick up where we left off last week, which is in chapter 20. We had a discussion about the raising of Eutychus in Troas, and Troas, as I said last week, is near the historical city of Troy, and it's on the coast of Asia Minor. And so this is one of those we passages, and I mentioned last week that the we passages are often really bound up with travel narratives. So I have this on the screen just to kind of show you just how much detail of travel there is here, to point out, that the way that the we passages work here, which is one of the reasons, to kind of repeat myself, that that people think that the we stuff might come from someone's travel diary, maybe even the author's own travel diary. And it's very specific, as you can see. 2015, for example, we sailed from there, and on the following day we arrived opposite Chios. The next day we touched at Samos. It's the kind of granular detail that you would expect from someone who had taken part, from someone who had been taking it down as they went. It's not, the vague recollections 30 years later or something like that. It seems very immediate and very specific. And it also, if you look in 2016, it sets up the end game in certain kinds of ways. It says, for Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he might not have to spend time in Asia. He was eager to be in Jerusalem if possible for the Pentecost. So, there's sort of a temporal constraint here that gets introduced, that Paul's really urgently wanting to get to Jerusalem, probably because Pentecost is symbolic in the book of Acts, right, as the birth of the Spirit, the time when the Spirit was brought to the people. We're about to celebrate Pentecost pretty soon here in the church year, and even in the year 2021, it's sort of a celebratory day. It's sort of a time of a lot of energy, and so I imagine that that's what Paul was thinking when he wanted to get back to Jerusalem for Pentecost. So he wants to go by Ephesus, but he doesn't want to stop there, and so there's this kind of speech that Paul gives. He wants to skip Ephesus, so he has all the elders from Ephesus come out and meet him offshore, and he summons them, and he kind of gives them this benedictory speech. He's sort of giving them his last will and testament, if you will, and it does have that flavor to it, because he is saying things like, none of you among whom I have gone about proclaiming the kingdom will ever see my face again, in 2025, that right there in the middle of the screen. He is talking about the danger he's going to be facing. The Holy Spirit testifies that in every city, imprisonment and persecutions are waiting for me in 2023. So he's very aware that like this is a perilous part of his career he's embarking on, and he's very aware that this is probably the last time they're going to see each other. And then there's also a defense of his way of working, and down in 2034, he says, "You know for yourselves that I worked with my own hands to support myself and my companions." Before we kind of properly started, we were talking about Paul's modus operandi, the way he would go around, go to a new city, go to the synagogue. And this is part of what he's saying here to defend himself and to defend, I assume, his honor against people who had been insinuating that he was, I don't know, skimming off the top or something. He's saying, no, I always supported myself by working with my own hands to support myself and my companions. So this is sort of, this is the speech where Paul gets to kind of make a final account of himself. He doesn't ever really get this opportunity in a wholesale way later in the book of Acts like you might expect. So this is sort of his defense of his apostolic ministry that happens here before these Ephesian elders. And if you might have heard the language I used, or I read there about what the Holy Spirit is saying in this passage. And it's worth just pointing out that in the latter part of Acts, the Holy Spirit takes on a more and more kind of directive role. So in that passage we were just looking at, you've got the phrase captive to the Spirit. Paul thinks of himself as bound in some translations to the Spirit. And that verse I just read about, the Holy Spirit says, in every city, imprisonment and persecution are waiting. He talks about being overseers. The Holy Spirit has made you overseers of the flock. And then later on, Zoom has put your faces over half of my text here, so it's hard for me to see all of what it says. But it says later on that through the Spirit, they told Paul not to go to Jerusalem. So the Spirit's starting to get pretty bossy later in the book of Acts, but that's not entirely new. Earlier in Acts, here at the bottom of this slide, we already talked about all of these, that the Spirit snatched Philip away after the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch. The Spirit of Jesus did not allow them to travel where they had intended to travel in chapter 16. And there's lots and lots of examples in Acts of the Spirit kind of telling someone to do something or forbidding them from doing something, or there's lots of language of filling. It's interesting, the degree to which the Spirit is a fluid in the book of Acts. And there's actually a famous book about Acts, sort of a theology of Acts, that asks, is the Spirit a fluid? And what does that mean if the Spirit is a fluid in the book of Acts? It's really the only place where it's described that way as thoroughly. So the Spirit will fill you, or it will fall on you, it will live in you. It's a very kind of overtaking presence in the book of Acts, and especially beginning in this part of Acts, where the Spirit more and more kind of asserts its authority and begins to really direct things, be in charge of everything. So that sets up a really interesting story in chapter 21, where Paul is visiting the house of a prophet named Agabus. And Acts had already visited Agabus once before in chapter 11, when the prophet Agabus there predicted that there would be this famine. And that famine, incidentally, this is sort of a full circle moment. The famine is what prompted Paul to begin taking up a collection for Jerusalem, which is now what he's trying to get back to Jerusalem to deliver. So he's met Agabus before, and Agabus seems to be kind of a Jesus movement prophet who has a pretty good track record. And so here in chapter 21, Agabus makes another prediction, which is that the Jews in Jerusalem will bind Paul and hand him over to the Gentiles. And so when Agabus makes this prediction that he's going to be bound and handed over to Gentiles, Paul is like, yeah, let's go. That sounds great to me. He's very willing to undertake that. And so we here, it's still a we section, we got ready to go back toward Jerusalem. when they get to Jerusalem, there's really this fascinating dynamic. Remember, Paul seems to have kind of severed his ties with Antioch and therefore with Jerusalem. He'd been out in the west of the empire for a while, or at least in the center of the empire. He'd been in Greece and in Asia Minor, and he hadn't really been touching base, it seems, with the folks back in Jerusalem, with James and Peter and people like that. But there was this conflict running all the way through Acts from the very beginning between kind of the Hellenists and the Hebrews, between the church that thinks Gentile inclusion is good and the church that thinks, no, this is a Jewish movement, and we need to keep it that way. And if you want to be a Gentile who comes in, you need to be Jewish first. So this conflict, has run all the way through. We've talked about it in prior weeks, and often, as you'll recall, it kind of turns on this question of Gentile conversion almost, right? Do you need to become Jewish in the sense of keeping dietary laws? Do you need to become Jewish in the sense of becoming circumcised? What's the level of Torah adherence that is necessary for Gentiles to become part of this community? There was the Jerusalem Council, there was Peter's vision, right? Remember that where God told Peter that it was okay to associate with Gentiles. Then there's this incident at Antioch we talked about last week where Peter decided not to eat with Gentiles, and that really made Paul angry. And so Paul writes, things like Galatians chapters 1 and 2, where he's pretty angry about this. I oppose Cephas to his face. There's 2 Corinthians and other parts of Galatians where Paul seems to be reacting to missionaries from that Jerusalem community who had come along behind him and told his churches, Paul's churches, that they needed to keep the Jewish law, and that made Paul angry. So there's this kind of long running tension in the book of Acts between these two camps. And Paul is very much, maybe I don't know if everyone would have agreed he was the leader, but he probably thought of himself as the leader of this pro-Gentile faction. And then there's the Hebrew faction, the ones probably led by James, who felt like, this is a Jewish movement and we should make sure we're doing the correct Jewish things. And so maybe that's part of why Paul brings the collection back to Jerusalem. He takes up a collection among the Gentile churches for the poor in Jerusalem, probably having to do with that famine. And he wants to bring it back perhaps as a sign of goodwill, as a show of support, as a show of solidarity. Look, these Gentiles are not, ignorant of you. They're not uncaring about you. They care about you, and they see you as kind of the source of all this. And so they're sending this collection back with me to be an expression of goodwill. So when Paul and the others get to Jerusalem in Acts 21, there's this really interesting scene where there's a reunion. And remember, there's a lot of water under the bridge between these people. So you might expect it to be a complicated reunion. And it says, when we arrived in Jerusalem, still we, the brothers, that is the Jerusalem folks, welcomed us warmly. Paul goes to visit with James, and all the elders are there. And Paul, tells them all the wonderful things that are going on among the Gentiles. And the Jerusalem church, the elders seem to think this is great, and they're praising God in 21:20. And then they say, but listen, there's how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews, and they are all zealous for the law. So here we have this long running conflict coming back into view. And in 21:21, they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews living among the Gentiles, that is in the diaspora, to forsake Moses, and that you tell them not to circumcise their children or observe the customs. What it then is to be done, they will certainly hear that you've come. And so, Paul, it seems, is faced with a problem that his reputation precedes him. It's not, what these people are saying about Paul isn't what Paul would say about himself, but it almost doesn't matter because his reputation is he's pretty anti-law. And if you remember all the way back to like chapter 7 of Acts, this is kind of what got Stephen in so much trouble. He was preaching against the temple, at least people thought he was, and therefore against kind of the past and the history of Israel. And so Paul is sort of being set up as a similar kind of figure here. So they say, this is James and the other elders. They're like, look, here's what you got to do. We've got these 4 men. They've made a vow, and this is sort of a religious show of piety that people would do in the temple. Join them, go through the rite of purification in the temple. You pay for them, for the part of the rituals they have to undergo, and that way everybody's going to know that you are on the up and up. No one's going to be able to accuse you of denying Moses or of denying the law. If you're in there, sponsoring literally enactments of piety. So Paul goes with them. Here's a model of the temple. Interestingly, the Temple Mount is in the news today because there's this running set of clashes between Palestinians and Israeli police forces. So this is a model. This is not the real thing, but it's depicting what once stood on the same site where that stuff was happening in the news today was happening. So Paul goes to this temple, and he is with these 4 men who are under a vow. And it's worth remembering, by the way, we're kind of looking at this picture of a reconstructed temple, but it's worth remembering, as I've said many, many times already, that by the time Acts was written, the temple was gone. So it's sort of an imagined space. I think that's really important, that we have to always keep that in mind, that as I gave this example a few weeks ago, it's like telling a story set in the World Trade Center in the year 2000, or in, say, August 2001. Something big is about to happen there, but the people in the story don't know it. So when we're hearing, Paul's going to the temple with these 4 men, we know, okay, something terrible is about to happen to this temple, and probably most of these people in the story, but the people in the story don't know it yet. So it's a drama that's kind of playing out in their imagination, because there's not a temple there anymore. So Paul goes there with them, and they do their thing. And while he's there, the Jews from Asia, that is diaspora Jews, other diaspora Jews, because Paul is himself a diaspora Jew, accuse him of doing the opposite of the thing he was there to kind of demonstrate. So Paul went to the temple with these men to try to show how pious he is, but they accuse him of teaching against the law and the people, and of bringing Gentiles into the temple. So there's a mob. This is a woodcut, an old woodcut of the scene that probably not that historically accurate, but kind of a fun depiction of it. They seize Paul. This mob seizes Paul, just like the mob seized Stephen earlier in the book of Acts. And they're trying to kill him, but there's this Roman cohort that's stationed at the temple, and it intervenes. So I'm going to go back one slide just to show you something. You'll notice on the left side of this temple reconstruction, there's the section that has the kind of the brownish roof, the reddish roof. That part was often occupied by this cohort of Roman soldiers that were stationed there. And so they could see down literally into the temple precincts. So that kind of explains how they were able to see that this was going on. Even though these people were in the temple trying to seize Paul, they were able to kind of catch sight of it. And so they, the Roman cohort intervenes in the mob scene, and the Romans seize Paul, from the mob, and it's this interesting swirl of identities, because the Romans, who are the colonial occupiers and the imperial forces, have seized one diaspora Jew from a mob composed of other diaspora Jews. And in the middle of this, Paul kind of gives a big emphatic statement of his identity. He says, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of an important city, which is, sort of a interesting thing to do in that moment, right? Where he thinks the thing to do to kind of make the situation better is to claim his insider status. He's like, look, I'm one of these people. I'm not sure what they're up to, but I'm a Jew just like them. And not only that, I'm an important person. I'm the citizen of an important city. Which turns out to be the right thing to do, because the Romans had actually thought, as the text of Acts goes on to explain, that Paul was this Egyptian who had been causing a lot of trouble, stirring up trouble. And so they were arresting him thinking he was this Egyptian, but then he speaks to them in Greek, and they realize, oh, he has more status than we thought he had. And he begins to his stock starts to rise. then he asks, hey, can I speak to the crowd? And they let him, and he speaks to the crowd in Hebrew. So there's this really interesting kind of shifting of identities that Paul is performing here, where he's speaking to the people he needs to speak to in the way that he needs to speak to them. And he's using insider language differently for different groups of people. He's speaking to the Romans, using one kind of insider language. And when he's speaking to fellow Jews, he's speaking with a different kind of insider language. He was skilled, in other words, at navigating the swirl of allegiances in colonial life. This is a familiar pattern for people who live on the underside of power even today, where you have to kind of code switch and talk to different groups in different ways to make yourself understood. And this is just what Paul's doing here. So he's skilled at navigating it, but he also gets really ensnared in those power webs sometimes, and that gets him into trouble, as it does here. So Paul gives a speech. It's kind of a defense of his call and his ministry. But when he gets to the part about where God sends him to the Gentiles, the crowd got really, really upset. So the crowd here in 22:22 says, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." And they were going to, try to seize him again, but the Romans have him. So the tribune decides that they're going to take him into custody, into the barracks, and ordered him to be examined by flogging, to try to, beat it out of him, basically. Like, let's figure out what he's done. And if we beat him up really good, he'll confess to whatever he's done to make all these people angry at him. For the second time, though, if you look further down in this passage on the screen, for the second time in the book of Acts, he claims not just the citizenship of a city, as he did a few verses earlier. He claims Roman citizenship. So they're gonna have him flogged, and in 22:25, they tied him up, and Paul says to the centurion, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who is uncondemned?" And it's interesting in these moments. This happened before in Philippi. It happens here too. As soon as Paul says that, everything flips, and suddenly the power dynamic shifts completely. So in 22:26, when the centurion heard that, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? This man is a Roman citizen." The tribune comes and says, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" Paul answers, "Yes." And the tribune says, "It costs me a lot of money to get that. How are you a citizen?" And Paul says, "Well, I was born one." Immediately, those who were about to examine him drew back from him. And the tribune also was also afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. So again, swirl of identities, swirl of allegiances. As soon as Paul asserts citizenship, everything flips, and he has suddenly status that he hadn't had before. From this point forward in Acts, Paul is always in Roman custody. He gets taken into custody by this cohort in the temple. He never leaves Roman custody in the book of Acts from this point forward. And these custodial settings are always interspersed with judicial settings for the rest of Acts. And there's this theorist, I think I've said before, that I'm using to write a book on Acts right now, named Achille Mbembe, who's a post-colonial theorist. And I love this quote. He says, "In some, colonies are zones in which war and disorder, internal and external figures of the political, stand side by side or alternate with each other. The colony is thus the site par excellence where controls and guarantees of judicial order can be suspended, the zone where the state of exception is deemed to operate in the service of civilization." What that means is, if you're in a court in a colonial setting, your status is not necessarily a question of legality. It's a question of what's most expedient for the colonizing power. And so if it makes the most sense for you to be thrown in jail, that's what's going to happen to you, whether it's strictly legal or not. And he's describing, French North Africa in the middle of the 20th century, but I think it adheres to what happens to Paul the rest of the way through the book of Acts. You have this really fascinating and kind of tragic series of custody and trials and imprisonment that really has very little to do with how guilty Paul is, and more to do with what the people need from him and from his case. So the next thing that the Romans do is they take Paul to the Sanhedrin. And this word, by the way, just means council. It's the Jewish council. They figure, well, we got to figure out what he did, because we can't flog him to get it out of him. So we're going to go ask the Sanhedrin, what's the big deal? And when they get there, Paul sort of pits the Pharisees and the Sadducees against each other, which again is a really savvy insider move. He's sort of noticing the factions in the room and targeting his arguments so that he can convince one of them that he's on their side and gain some allies out of it. He accidentally, though, insults the high priest while he's doing this. And this is sort of a major faux pas, because he doesn't, not only are you not supposed to insult the high priest, but it also means he didn't recognize the high priest, which is the kind of mistake that an outsider would make. He knows enough, he's enough of an insider to know that you shouldn't insult the high priest, and he's really sorry that he did it, but he is enough of an outsider that he didn't even know what the high priest looked like. This suggests, that that the thing he's being accused of being kind of an outsider isn't entirely wrong, that he is in some ways on the outside. So they take Paul, the tribune takes Paul back into custody. The Jews, meanwhile, are plotting to kill Paul in an ambush. But Paul's nephew, no, that's later. Is it? Yeah, no, it's here. Paul's nephew tips off the authorities that they're going to try to ambush him and kill him, and so they avoid that. And then this really interesting thing happens. The tribune writes a letter to the governor, and I have that here on the screen. Scholars are a little bit divided over whether this is, an authentic copy of this letter that was sent, or whether the author of Acts has composed it based on what he thinks would have been said. But it's a pretty interesting little letter. It leaves out some pretty salient details, if you notice. So Claudius Lysias, to his excellency, the governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. But when we saw that he was a Roman citizen, I came with the guard and rescued him. That's not entirely how the book of Acts tells the story, right? They didn't know that they were rescuing him, and they didn't know that he was a Roman citizen when they did it. So this tribune is kind of covering his tracks a little bit and making it look like he was a little bit more heroic than he was. And so he continues, I wanted to know what they were accusing him of, so I brought him before the council. I found that he was accused, concerning some things about their law, but I didn't see any real reason to keep him or to kill him, certainly. And so I'm sending him to you because I knew that they were going to try to assassinate him. So this is the first inkling we get that Roman power is going to, in this part of Acts, be portrayed pretty ambivalently. I've said earlier on, and some of you have said you've been reading Justo Gonzalez's work. Justo Gonzalez is pretty confident that that the author of Acts is pro-Roman Empire. And I think that's mostly true, but there are also places like this where the figures representing the Roman Empire look a little shady. They look a little bit underhanded. They look a little self-serving. They're not telling the entire truth. And that's going to be a theme from this point forward. This tribune is only the first of the people to really do that. So they do transfer Paul to Felix. And so Felix is the governor of Rome, the governor for Rome of the province. And so he's the one that the buck kind of stops with him. He's the highest authority in that area. And Felix decides to stage a formal trial. The Jews who are Paul's opponents bring a lawyer. His name is Tertullus. In those days, lawyers, maybe in these days too, lawyers are mostly not there to sort of make arguments from the law. They're there to kind of tell a narrative. They're there to kind of give a sense of the story. And so that's what Tertullus is doing. Tertullus accuses Paul of being pestilent and being an agitator, being a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes or the Nazareans, and he accuses him of profaning the temple. So what Tertullus is doing here, someone's audio is on, I think. So what Tertullus is doing is trying to portray Paul as in very negative kind of light. He's trying to portray Paul as an agitator, as a threat to the Roman Empire, as a threat to order, and as someone who needs to be dealt with. And so where the Tribune had said, this guy is just, it's a dispute about the Jewish law, we shouldn't get involved, Tertullus is saying you should get involved because this guy's dangerous. Tertullus, by the way, uses the word Nazarene to describe the group that Paul is involved in. And that suggests that Tertullus doesn't really know what he's talking about, because that group called themselves two things: one, the Way, and two, Christians. And only outsiders really called them Nazarenes. So it seems like Tertullus wasn't really up to speed on who these people were.
Excuse me,
So
so that
Acts,
means that Paul was not, this is not Paul's house arrest. This is when Paul was in the guards, in the military custody in the jail.
that's right. That's right. He's in the custody of the governor right now at this point. Yeah. So, and he will be for a little while. He'll get moved around a little bit, but he'll be in that custody for a while. And so Acts then at this point says, well, Felix didn't really want to decide the trial. It's going back to that quote I gave you a minute ago from Achille and Bembe. It's not in Felix's best interest to decide this, because it's a no-win situation. So what he does is he puts Paul in prison for 2 years, just kind of waits him out. He's hoping to get a bribe out of him or something. So Felix just puts him away. In prison, you know, I don't think prison is ever a really good time. Ancient prison was especially bad. It was especially grim, and it was a dangerous place and a very unhealthy place. And so it's not a bad strategy if you're someone like Felix to just leave somebody in there, let them fend for themselves, and maybe after a couple of years in jail, they'll come up with some money to bribe you with and get out. But eventually, Felix is succeeded. His term ends, and so he's succeeded by another governor named Festus. And so Festus comes along and decides, okay, I got to deal with this guy who's been in prison now for 2 years. We got to decide his trial. So he calls the parties together, and the Jews, who are still, trying to get Paul convicted, they say, well, no, we really need to move the trial back to Jerusalem, because we think that's where it should be. That's probably partly because they want to ambush him, but also partly because they know that they'll have a more sympathetic audience in Jerusalem than they would in Caesarea, where Paul is being held. And so Paul at this moment says, you know what, this isn't going very well. I've been in jail for 2 years. I am a citizen of the Roman Empire. I'm going to invoke my right to have a trial before the emperor. So this is the moment where Paul says, I want to see the emperor, which is his right if indeed he is a citizen of the Roman Empire. And so after Paul claims his right to have his case heard by the emperor, but before he goes to see the emperor, there's this new moment that comes where the king comes along, Agrippa. And Agrippa's the king, and so it's a little confusing, like, why would there be a king if it's an empire? There's already an emperor and there's a governor, but here's this king. And this has to do with the same kind of thing that you see in the Gospels with, the Herods, where Jesus gets shuttled back and forth with King Herod. And it's the same thing you see in the beginning of Luke, where you've got Caesar Augustus, but also Herod. It's the same kind of situation. So what the Romans did is they would install local kings who had very little real power, but they were there to kind of be figureheads and keep things from breaking into rebellion. And so Agrippa was the king, and his sister Bernice, or Berenike, was with him. And these were two people who were really, really well known for trying to keep the peace between Rome and Judea. Again, Judea is a pretty rebellious place. There's already been lots of threats of violence, and they wanted to kind of keep that under control. And so that's part of what Agrippa did as his job, was to try to build as many bridges as they could and keep the peace. And so Agrippa and Bernice come to say, to welcome Festus because he's new. And they clearly know a lot more local knowledge than Festus does. Festus is probably brought in from Italy or from some other place in the empire. He doesn't know these people. He doesn't know the local customs, but Agrippa does. And so Agrippa says, well, let me talk to this guy. And so he has an audience. Paul has an audience with Agrippa and his sister Bernice. And it's a really fascinating exchange, because clearly Agrippa is able to perceive things that neither Felix nor Festus were able to perceive. And he's even kind of joking with him, like, hey, are you trying to convert me right now? And Paul's like, well, maybe. So it's a really interesting exchange. And Agrippa comes up with the statement at the very bottom there that says, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to the emperor. Agrippa doesn't actually have the authority to do that. That's still Festus's authority. But if Agrippa had come in and said, we should just let this guy go, that's probably what would have happened. But because Paul had already appealed his case to the emperor, that's where he had to go. And Paul, again, probably just felt like that was his best shot. He probably felt like, I'm not going to survive too much longer in jail. I need to throw a Hail Mary here. And that's what he did. It's the kind of thing where you can either die in prison or you can, go to Rome and probably die in Rome, but maybe not. So he was taking the best chance he knew how to take. So chapter 27 begins with another we section and another travel narrative, when they decide that they're going to go to Italy because Paul has to go see the emperor. So again, we hear lots of detail, as there always are in the we sections. Lots of places, lots of chronology. Not terribly exciting reading, honestly. It's a lot of just travel diary kind of stuff. And the we section here, by the way, goes all the way through chapter 27 and into, chapter 28, about halfway through chapter 28. So it's a very long we section. This part of Acts is really dramatic. There's a lot of adventure. There's a shipwreck. There's dramatic sea voyage kind of moments. There are interactions with the natural world. This is a picture of Paul being bitten by a snake in Malta, which is a very dramatic sequence. This is part of the book of Acts, a part of the book of Acts that causes a lot of scholars to think that Luke was either relying on or informed by traditions like the Odyssey or the Iliad, because some of the the dramatic sea voyage kind of stuff is familiar from books like the Odyssey, where Odysseus is going around having misadventures, trying to get home. That's sort of what Paul's doing here. In a way, he's having all these misadventures, not trying to get home, but trying to get to safety somehow. Others, so some people think that Luke here is kind of borrowing from Homer. Others think that because of all the we language here, it's an accurate historical account, and that it's all these crazy things really did happen to Paul on the way from Caesarea to Rome. Finally, in 28:16, the narrative arrives in Rome. By the way, one of my favorite little tidbits in chapter 28 is when they don't sail directly to Rome. They sail into the Bay of Naples, which is where the city of Naples is today. And there's this fun little detail there where they encounter Jesus followers there, which I think just speaks to kind of the geographical range of the book of Acts, where even in this little relatively small town, a long way from Jerusalem and nowhere that Paul had ever been before, he runs into people who are already followers of Jesus, which just suggests that the movement is really making a lot of inroads, even in some of the smaller cities. And they travel from there up the Appian Way to the city of Rome. And when you get to Rome, the we section ends, and it switches back to third person plural. They do this, they do that. Although there's a little seam here, and I've put these two verses. These are 28:16 and 28:17. So 28:16 says, when we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with the soldier who was guarding him. And then 28:17, 3 days later, he called together the local leaders of the Jews. I see that first verse as sort of, following the we stuff pretty closely. The sort of sense of the we section that's been all along, that this is kind of the final resting place of Paul in the we section. The 28:17 doesn't, to me, follow directly after. 3 days later doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would follow after he's allowed to live there by himself, which is sort of has an ongoing nature kind of sense to it. So I think here's, maybe a slightly visible seam where one source is ending and another source is beginning, or Luke's own narration is beginning. The balance of chapter 28 has Paul kind of living in suspended animation. He's allowed to live on his own under house arrest. So he's not in a prison like he was in Caesarea, which it's got to come as a relief. He's able to kind of summon some of the local leadership, the Jews in the city, to him and meet with them. And some of them, the text says, were convinced, and others of them were not convinced, which is par for the course for Paul throughout the book of Acts. And it says Paul lived there 2 whole years at his own expense and welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. Which kind of raises the question, what happened after the 2 whole years? Because the book of Acts doesn't tell us. It's sort of a cliffhanger ending here. The time frame of 2 whole years suggests something happened after that. And surely, whether Acts was written around the year 70 on the early end, or in the late 1st century, or even the early to mid 2nd century, no matter what dating you give, Paul almost certainly had died by then. And so probably the author of Acts knew what had happened and just isn't telling us. And there's so many different theories about why this might be. It might be that after those 2 whole years, Paul had a trial before the emperor and lost and was executed. And the author didn't want to end the story that way. It might be that the kind of narrative arc of the story of Acts really works best if you have Paul in the city of Rome, at the center, the very heart of the Roman Empire, and that's what was symbolically important to accomplish in that particular moment. And that, it might be somehow that the author just didn't know what had happened. There's also this kind of fringe theory that Paul, who had desperately wanted to get to Spain all these years, was let go, was acquitted, or whatever language you want to use, and was able to travel to Spain, and then died later. And so, maybe the author of Luke and Acts was planning a 3rd volume that we don't know about and they didn't get to write, or maybe this was just the natural ending point for this volume. Whatever the case may be, it ends here sort of in an unsatisfying kind of way, because we want to know what happens to this guy we followed his every move for 28 chapters, well, for about 20 chapters. And we want to know how this whole story, the 28 chapter story of the book of Acts, has concluded, but we're not privy to it. It doesn't tell us that ending. So it's kind of a curious ending, but I think it also at the end fulfills that thing that was said in chapter 1, verse 8, which is where the resurrected Jesus at the very beginning of Acts said, "You're going to be my witnesses to the ends of the earth." And I think by ending the story in the city of Rome, that's in some ways what Acts has accomplished. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we have about 40 minutes to talk it through, and not only this section, but the whole sweep of the book of Acts we can talk about. What are your thoughts?
I have a question about Paul and the Holy Spirit. And I'm wondering if you think, Eric, he was more influenced by the way the Jews thought about the Holy Spirit, or do you think his ideas were more Greco-Roman? And any thoughts on that?
My own sense is that he was thoroughly Jewish. There's people who go looking for Stoic influence on Paul, or mystery cult influence, and I think you can find all the raw materials you need in the Jewish tradition to think about the Spirit in this kind of way. And so, even the way the book of Acts portrays it, they cite the prophet Joel at the moment when the Holy Spirit arrives at the story of Pentecost. So you don't need to go looking for anywhere else. I think you can You can understand the work of the Spirit in Acts and in Paul's thought, or at least the Paul you meet in Acts thought, in terms of this Jewish tradition.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Certainly informed by other things, but I think he's pretty mainstream Jewish here.
So Eric, if people go to Rome and look at the Christian sites, we are shown a prison where supposedly Paul and Peter were imprisoned and they were finally executed. What do we make of all that?
That's a great question. So the Bible itself does not tell us anything about the ending of Paul. There's sort of an implication that, you know, Peter's not going to meet a good end, but it's not explicitly narrated. But in the city of Rome, from a pretty early time, there's a tradition that both Peter and Paul had died there. And by pretty early on, I mean the letter First Clement, which comes in the late 1st century. It's one of the earliest Christian documents that's not in the New Testament. In that letter, there's an implication that Peter and Paul had both died in the city of Rome. So there is, you know, this really early tradition of that, which is probably, you know, enough evidence to say that that's probably what happened. In terms, yeah, if you go to Rome today, in terms of that sort of archaeological stuff, yes, you will get shown all kinds of things. Interestingly, the early traditions about Peter and Paul focus on a swamp outside of the city of Rome, where often criminals were taken to be executed, and the name of that swamp was the Vatican. Turns out later on they built the Vatican on top of that swamp, which is, you know, how they were able to get the land. It was not really desirable real estate. And in recent years, if you've gone to St. Peter's Basilica, they will take you underneath St. Peter's and show you some of the early tombs that seem to have been martyr shrines, you know, tombs and shrines to martyrs who had been executed there. And there are some that demonstrate early, and by early I mean like 3rd and 4th century devotion to Peter and Paul. So that's the story. And they even did like a genetic analysis, which was kind of absurd, where they tested some of the bones that were found there and said, oh, it was a Palestinian man in his 60s or something, as if that proves, okay, this is Peter or Paul. But so it's a little bit overconfident, I think, but the traditions all point to that's what happened, that they met their end, both of them, probably under the persecutions of Nero in the city of Rome in probably the 60s. And certainly, you know, just today on Twitter, I saw an exchange where someone was saying, hey, I'm going to the Rome for the first time. What should I see? And this Roman Catholic Bible scholar said, well, you have to go to the basement under St. Peter's and see the excavations where they found Peter and Paul's bones, you know. So it depends on your confessional commitments. I think sometimes how much credence you give to some of that, and that's certainly understandable.
Hello, I've got a question for Eric. This is Steve. Eric, I've heard it said that if there was no Paul, there would have been no spread of Christianity in the early years, or at least not as pervasive as it was. Do you think that's true, or would somebody else have come along? Did somebody else come along and do what Paul did in later years?
It's a great question.
Thank you.
There were others, of course. There were, you know, people like Apollos, who appears both in the book of Acts and in some of Paul's letters, as another evangelist who is out there doing the same kind of work. My own sense, though, is that without Paul, we wouldn't be sitting here doing this. That Paul's the impetus behind it. If you think even in terms of you know, raw survival, you've got this Jerusalem church, and it sends out people like Paul, and then the Jerusalem's destroyed, right? So it's sort of like you know, sending out lifeboats, and then the main ship goes down. Maybe the main ship, there's traditions about it, you know, where they fled to and what they did after that. But it does seem like the lifeboats that Paul put out there were the ones that actually survived and the ones that went on to make an impact. So my own sense is, you know, without without Paul's work, maybe Christianity is relegated to maybe it doesn't go away. Maybe it's a minor kind of thing. Maybe it still flourishes, but it would have developed in really, really different ways than it has.
Were the churches that he founded in effect for hundreds of years? Do we know? Was there early historical documents about many of those?
We don't really know. This is a really interesting historical problem, I think, because sometimes I'm talking to people who are anxious, as many of us mainline Protestants are, that our churches are not thriving, that we're not flourishing. And I say, well, you can't go see the First United Methodist Church of Corinth today. It's not there anymore. You can't go see First Christian Church of Thessaloniki. And so what's important is not the survival of a particular institution, but the survival of the whole. In the city of Rome, ironically, there's a little bit more evidence than there is elsewhere, just because Rome ended up being, the epicenter of Western Christianity for so long. So you have in Rome what are called the tituli, the title churches, which don't exactly have records, of what they did or what they were up to, but there are at least sites associated with them, like they're associated with this particular part of Rome, near the gate of whatever. And that gives us some insight, that there was a persistent presence for a couple hundred years or something like that. But interestingly, no, probably because there's no durable architecture, like they don't have buildings for the first 200 or 300 years. There's nothing really to mark their presence. And so they seem to have been more transient than we might have expected. So long way to say, no, not really. We don't really know a lot about them and what happened to them.
Thank you.
Along comes Constantine in the early 300s, and he pays for the building of a bunch of what are called Constantinian basilicas. There's one in Jerusalem, St. Peter's, Old St. Peter's was one of them. All the major cities get one. And that's the first time really there's something durable in terms of like a monument or architecture that sticks around through time.
Just curious, if Paul hadn't done what he did, would Christianity have been pretty much more of the Orthodox strain?
Well, I think it would have been very Jewish, because Paul's the main one saying Gentiles, Gentiles, Gentiles. So without Paul, I think there's probably not that counterbalance. Probably it would have been a sect of Judaism, and it might have survived today, but it would have looked really, really different. Probably none of us would be here talking about it.
Yeah, on that
It's a great question.
On that same vein, this is Jeff here. Do you have any thoughts on how the pre-existence of the diaspora before that and this network of Jews living all over Asia Minor and into Greece and elsewhere kind of set the stage for Paul to even do what he did?
Yeah, that's a great question. The diaspora is so critical, right? Because it was this pre-existing almost like capillary system where there were networks of Jews, and not only Jews, but also Gentiles who were affiliated, came to synagogue worship, or came to whatever religious things that they had going on. We were talking about synagogues earlier, but people, Gentiles who were affiliated plus Jews. And there was this network all through the Roman Empire. So without that, and without the Roman Empire itself, I think providing safe travel for people like Paul, it's hard to imagine it spreading the way that it did. So, interestingly, Christianity doesn't spread nearly as quickly or as far to the east as it does to the west. There are legends, there are stories that, Thomas went to India and founded Christian sects there. And in fact, the first church I ever served was a Methodist church, and it was in a town where there was a Methodist retirement home for missionaries. And a few of the women who lived in that home had been missionaries in India, and they were just absolutely emphatic that yes, Thomas came to India and founded Christianity there. But it doesn't spread to the east, partly because there's not the network of diaspora and the network of Roman roads and things like that there was to the west. So I think those are critical factors for sure. Even though, there's lots of Roman culture to the east, there's connections, there's trade routes, there's even Roman temples. There's a Roman temple in Sri Lanka in the 1st century. But it's not quite the same density. So it spreads westward rather than eastward or southward or northward. Great question. Yeah. And it also spreads, as you could see, both from Paul's letters and the book of Acts, through Roman urban centers. It's not just Roman stuff, it's Roman urban stuff. And so there's this whole interesting discourse in the last 30 years or so in biblical scholarship about urban Christianity and why did Paul and so many others focus so much on urban communities instead of the rural communities. It's not until like the 600s that often rural communities convert to Christianity, when the cities had been Christian for 500 years.
Do you think there's a way of maybe looking at that the other way around, where maybe the urban centers would have been more receptive to that somehow, or that's where the synagogues were? That's an interesting point you made, because it seems like rather than saying that it just didn't spread to the rural areas first, you might think of it that those areas were receptive to it, had the right ears to hear what was being said.
Yeah, so I think part of what's going on there in my mind is, like, I'm from a really, really rural place. I'm from rural North Carolina. And it took a while for me to make it to a city as big as Denver, but once I'm here, I found myself sort of isolated, right? Like, I don't have my family around me. All I have is my wife and children, like my aunts and uncles and grandparents and my parents. They all live somewhere else. And so I'm really uprooted from everything that I know. And I think that's what the case was in the ancient world too, is people would go to the cities for a lot of the same reasons people go to the cities today, for opportunity, because they didn't have a choice. They're trying to migrate, or they get sold into slavery, and that's where the people with enough money to buy slaves live. And they find themselves there, and they're uprooted from their ancestral religions, from their local cults. They don't have mom nearby to remind them, and so they're just they're more susceptible. And not only is it religion, but it's also if you imagine yourself brand new to a city like Thessaloniki, and from the countryside, and you're just new to town and you don't know what to do, you don't have anywhere to live, you don't have anything to eat, and someone says, well, we have the Lord's Supper, you want to come to the Lord's Supper? Suddenly that's pretty compelling as an invitation. And there's a book called The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark. And most of Rodney Stark, most of his work I don't like that much, but that he kind of makes this point in this book that by extending hospitality to these people who had been uprooted and kind of displaced, either through diaspora or through kind of economic diaspora, then that's a natural way for Christianity to succeed.
Do you think there's anything else about the Christian message that made it receptive to people that were in the pre-existing so-called pagan world of the time, that this message had a compelling aspect to it that they weren't getting from what they had available to them?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a few things. One of them is, we see this from a lot of ancient sources, is that just that Judaism was held in pretty high regard in this polytheistic context, where there was a lot of what we would call religion that was mixed with politics and culture, that people looked at Judaism and said, well, here's a really ancient religion or cult or whatever that has upright morals and believes in one God. And for a certain segment of the people, that was really compelling. And I think Christianity piggybacks on that. And that becomes, a pretty powerful argument. The other thing I think that happens a lot is just the claims about Jesus having died and risen again. If you read, Christian apologetic literature from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, where they're trying to explain themselves to what we sometimes call cultured despisers, these Roman elite who are sneering at the Christians. But what the Christians will say back is, yeah, but look, this guy, they killed him and he's alive again. And that seems to have been a really useful argument, that people found, this hope of life after death to be really, really powerful. And that becomes a defining feature of Christianity in the 3rd and 4th centuries, this, focus on martyrs, focus on saints, this notion that death is not the final word. I think, in a world where people lived to be 35 and infant mortality was sometimes 50%, death is not the final word is a pretty wonderful message. And so I think, go ahead, Steve.
Thanks, Eric. I just want to make a quick comment. I remembered about that question, Jeff. What was appealing about it? A couple of years ago, maybe we had the scholar Albert Hernandez talk to us about this issue. Maybe you know him, Eric. And Albert said that he doesn't think it's widely known that the women, the mothers in those first couple hundred years were highly responsible for passing on the faith, and it appealed to them because of the care for the elderly and the widow, those commands. And it was not something obviously that was done in the ancient world, and that was of great attraction, great appeal to the women of that time. I always remember that, thought that was an interesting reason why in the first couple hundred years it may have flourished.
I know Albert Hernandez well. We were in a meeting together this morning. Yes, so I think that's right. And this is another thing that those culture despisers say about Christianity. Oh, it's just women and slaves. And that's their way of saying there's nobody important here to hear from. Why are we paying attention to these people? But for women and slaves, that was a really important thing, right?
There were a lot of women as slaves.
Yeah, there were a lot of them. And there was a feeling that, okay, this is for us. This is not some patriarchal elite thing where you have to buy the priesthood for a year's wages or something. This is something where, I'm valued and I can have a role. And not that all Christians were of lower social classes or social statuses, but a lot of them were. And I think it was a really compelling thing. The other interesting dynamic to that, that develops in like the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries is Roman inheritance laws made it so that women who were widowed, which happened a lot, did not necessarily have to remarry. And so there were a lot of women walking around with big inheritances from their dead husbands and lots of disposable income. And that was one of the ways that Christianity kind of funded itself, is by, by giving a place to these women who had resources but did not have status. They didn't have standing in society. They couldn't go and become a civic leader, but in the Christian community, they could become something pretty important and bring their resources. And so that was a major focus. And in fact, in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, you get cult of virginity, and where devoted virgins become really important, both men and women who abstain from sexuality. And this could be young people who had never been married, or it could be people who are widowed or became widowers, who decided to abstain from sexuality. And this becomes a powerful economic engine for the church. So yeah, lots of interesting factors. If you're looking for a book on this is getting a long way from the book of Acts, but there's this new book out called Melania the Younger. Melania, just like Melania Trump. And Melania the Younger was one of the richest women ever to live. And her grandmother, Melania the Elder, was also one of the richest women ever to live. And both of them forsook everything and went off to become kind of monastic figures. And there's, I think Elizabeth Clark wrote Melania the Younger, but it's a great, very compelling book that kind of goes through some of these dynamics and what's the role of women, what's the role of sexuality, what's the role of community, what are the family obligations they're trying to juggle as they're off in a hermit cave somewhere. It's really fascinating.
Eric, there are a couple of references in what we read for tonight using the image followers of the way. Do you have deeper ideas about what the way meant in their usage, or what it meant to be a follower of the way?
I wish I did. I don't really. It's a very compelling branding, if I could be cynical about it. I think it's a better word than Christian for sure.
Yes.
And yeah. And it suggests, a journey, a path that, yeah. So I guess I kind of assumed that it was a shortened form of like the way of Jesus or the way of Christ or something like that. But I don't know a ton about it. I bet there's some really fascinating scholarship on that.
I find it very appealing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In Greek, I think it's hodos in Greek. And there's all sorts of hodos in the New Testament. The road to Emmaus is a hodos. When Jesus is, passing through Samaria, those are all, it's the same word, if I'm not mistaken, that gets used. And so it does have like this normal basic meaning of just a road. I could be mistaken on that, but that's, I think, true.
I only remember that because it was on like multiple vocabulary tests. So yeah, it can mean road, path, way, all that stuff. So.
And the Hebrew equivalent is Derek, which always, if you know somebody named Derek, their name means road.
Yeah, and I remember because it's one of those words that they want you to know because it's so often used. It's one of the most highly used words in the New Testament. So
yeah. The road to Damascus, it's a hodos. What else do you want to talk about? Anywhere in the book of Acts, any themes that we want to lift out? Any big conclusions at the end of it? Some of you have been quiet for 4 weeks. I know you've got thoughts.
Philip showed up in the beginning as, with the Ethiopian, and then he showed up somewhere near the end, I think. And I wasn't sure that was the same Philip.
I'm not sure either. Let's see if I can look it up on the fly here. I cannot. It's not working. That's interesting. Some of the characterization in the book of Acts is, to our modern eyes, kind of sloppy, right? Like characters are introduced and then they just disappear, or they come back. Like Agabus is a good example where he's makes an appearance later in the book that seems unconnected to his earlier appearance. So I don't know, what to make of someone like Philip, who plays this like really critical role in a very zoomed in scene and then doesn't really play another big part. Did anyone look up where Philip comes in later? I can't get my iPad to work. But that's interesting. And so if you're writing a novel, that might not be the best way to treat your characters, right? To kind of drop them in and then ignore them the rest of the time. But for the book of Acts, I think the author is kind of pulling in figures when it makes sense for them to be in the story, and then there's no need to keep up with them later. I can see people looking down at their Bibles. Sorry, go ahead, Don.
Okay, this is kind of an ongoing concern. The traditions that were so strongly held up in Jerusalem, circumcision and that kind of stuff, the struggle to go from one God to three gods doesn't seem to be very illuminating in the scripture. It's just, and I don't know if there's a source where I could read about how that got hammered out, why it wasn't kept purely, like circumcision in the Jewish tradition and fought for. Is there something that you could unpack there or expand a little bit on?
What an interesting question. Because you're right, there are claims about Jesus already in the New Testament that he's divine that you would think would really upset the sensibilities of a pretty traditional Jewish thinker. And that doesn't seem to be the sticking point ever. There's other sticking points about law adherence and things like that, but they're not worried about theology. They're not worried about Christology. I don't have any good readings for you other than, I think where Christianity kind of hammers this out is the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea. Like that's where there were these really divergent understandings of who Jesus was. And by really divergent, I mean, there are people who think that he's a fully human person, and there's people who think he's fully divine, and there's people in the middle, and there's people who think he's a divine person pretending to be human, and there's people who think he's a human pretending to be divine. There's people who think he's both, but the divine gets to drive, so there's all kinds of different options out there, this incredible diversity. And then along comes Nicaea, and that gets narrowed down in this bottleneck to what we think of as sort of modern Trinitarian thought, that there's a Father and a Son and a Spirit, although they didn't really have the Spirit all that well developed yet. And I guess all I can say is this all happened long before that happened, that the Book of Acts and everything going on in the Book of Acts is taking place 300 years before that all goes down at Nicaea. And so they just didn't know about it. And maybe it hadn't come into full resolution yet, the implications of saying that Jesus is divine, or maybe it was language that was fuzzy enough that they could, look past it, or maybe they were thinking in more traditional terms in terms of what a Messiah was, that it was a Jewish leader and not necessarily a divine figure. But you're right. And I don't have a good resource to point you to, other than I bet there are some. I just don't know what they are. Because that's a great question. Why isn't this more scandalous?
Thank you.
Yeah. You should write it.
How did and why did circumcision become such a topic of importance? Was it for medical reasons or religious reasons? Who started? Who brought it to the forefront?
It's a good question. It turns out Jews are not by any means the only people who circumcised. There were lots of cultures that circumcised. The Egyptians circumcised. And there are different theories about why. Some of them do have to do with disease and that kind of thing, and others have to do with, centering male pleasure. We could get into that. But yeah, so I think the consensus broadly, and I'm not an expert in this by any means, is that by, 1000 BCE, it had just become a marker of identity, in the same way that, if you have a blue and orange car in Denver, people are going to assume you must be a Broncos fan, whether you are or not. That's what blue and orange buys you. It becomes just a symbol of identity, whatever the origins of it were. So much that, when Greek culture comes in and they start exercising naked in gymnasia, people begin to notice, oh, you must be Jewish because you're circumcised, even though other cultures did it too. It became just an overt marker. So you could ask the same question, I think, for like eating pork, and people have asked that question. Is it about trichinosis? Is it about some sort of, health thing? And I think most scholars end up saying, well, no, it's just because we're people who don't eat pork. We're people who don't eat pork, and we're people who circumcise our baby boys, and that's just who we are as people. And it's not a very satisfying explanation, but it's that's the one I see most frequently for circumcision.
Back to Don Dutter's question about the Trinity. One of the many, many appealing things I like about Acts, and Eric, you've helped me see some additional ones, is Peter's initial speech in Acts 2, where he very deliberately says, Jesus the Nazarene was a man whose credentials God proved through wonders, miracles, and signs. And that same naming of Jesus as human shows up one other time in what I've read in the past 2 weeks. But I find that a very persuasive and appealing starting point.
Yeah. And you know, Peter would know, right? Like they used to hang out together. So it's a compelling testimony because this is someone who probably knew more intimately than anyone else, you know, the human side of this person, Jesus. They were together for a long time. And it's interesting to think about. So sometimes I ask my students to pretend like you're the director of a play and to try to stage biblical text, try to imagine what you're going to tell the actors to do in that moment. And the way Peter intones that sentence makes a big difference, right? This Jesus was a man, or this Jesus was a man, you know, that makes a difference. And I can imagine Peter articulating, putting the emphasis on man there as a sort of implicit rebuttal to people who are trying to say this Jesus was a God. He could be saying no. He could also just be using a generic word to describe a person. But it's an interesting thing to think through. Like, how do you stage that moment where Peter has come to this epiphany and he's now telling everyone, and part of that epiphany is the words, Jesus was a man. It's good to think through for those of you who are acting as liturgists in the church service, right? Like, how do you put the emphasis on different words and it changes the meaning?
We used to have these talks in our liturgy class about ritual integrity versus ritual quality, right? Like, what are those things that have to be present for it to be a ritual and be valid? And then how do we do it, right? What quality, where do we put the emphasis on the words? Where do we pause for effect and all that stuff? So yeah, that's a thing. I mean, that's the way you say the words matters a lot. In my opinion anyway. But
I used to live in Nashville, Tennessee, and there was a Shakespeare in the Park series. And one summer they did As You Like It as a old Western shoot 'em up kind of, you know, sheriff and posse kind of play. And they used all the same words that Shakespeare wrote down, but the whole thing was done with these old West Southern accents, you know, and it worked because all you have to do is put the emphasis differently and suddenly you're telling a different story. It's a rainy, cold, dark night. Go ahead, Ann.
It's been 4 challenging weeks. I'm going to have to think about it for a long time. Love to have you come back in 6 months and talk with us again.
Well, it's been really helpful for me. You know, it's challenging too to kind of think through the text in new ways. I've spent a couple of years now trying to write a book on this thing, and it's easy to get lost in that. And you know, I think I've said before, I come from this tradition that kind of lionizes Acts. It thinks it's a blueprint for the church, and so I kind of grew up thinking that and taking that for granted, that it was a blueprint for how to do these things. And I think it is, but it's also a blueprint that that challenges us, as you're saying, and makes us kind of rethink some of our assumptions about who we are and where we come from. And I really value that. And I've had a great time with all of you and your good questions and your brilliant insights. It's been a lot of fun. Maybe next time we get together, we can do it in a room somewhere. How would that
Amen
be?
to that.
Could I ask one more question if we still have a couple minutes with Eric that I may have missed in the earlier session, but Eric, about Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus, I believe we assume it was a vision, not an actual literal appearance of Jesus. I'm sure a lot of people believe it was a vision. And what would have led Paul to that? Would he have been driven by guilt from Stephen's stoning, or what mentally may have been going on with Paul that led him to that conversion? If we assume it
PTSD.
was not, yeah, just a small question there in the last 2 minutes we have.
Well, I'll say two things. I don't
Please
know if either
forgive
of
me
them
if you
will
covered
answer your
that
question.
already, too.
No, so I'm one of those people who don't think it was a conversion. I think it was a call. So Paul, doesn't convert as far as I can tell. He's Jewish. He stays Jewish. He doesn't become anything new. He's still Jewish. He just thinks Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. And in terms of, I'm weird this way because I don't, as you can probably tell, like I don't really get hung up on whether Jesus was divine or not. It doesn't bother me that much, which it might be strange to hear me say as someone who's an ordained minister. It really doesn't bother me. So I don't need there to be supernatural things happening. However, in Acts and in Paul's own letters, I sort of believe him that he had this experience. I think it's something that clearly had a big impact on his life, and it's something that other people knew. The author of Acts knew had a big impact on Paul's life. And for me, I guess I'm most comfortable thinking that the resurrected Jesus appeared to him, and not looking for supernatural or for rather psychological reasons. Even though I don't know if I believe in a resurrected Jesus, that's kind of how I prefer to tell the story. So yeah, there are a lot of people who do kind of psychologize Paul, and there's a long tradition of this, maybe beginning with Augustine and Martin Luther and people like that. And there's something to that. I think PTSD is real, and you see that in almost all the resurrection stories where someone encountered Jesus. They don't know who he is. They don't recognize him. It's all very disorienting, and that's kind of what happens to Paul too. So you could read it that way, but I kind of just think, I think he met Jesus. I don't know what else to say.
I think
That story gets told 3 times. Sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's fine. I didn't mean to interrupt. I don't think I was at the class when you guys actually talked about that that chapter, but since Steve opened the door, I'm going to continue to stand in the doorway, I guess. But it seems to me almost as important that he had the experience as what in particular Acts has Jesus saying to him. In his later theology, he says, "You're stop persecuting me." And it seems that when Paul has his later letters and discussions with the people, he's talking about the body of Christ, and that it's no longer I that live, but Christ that lives in me. I mean, do you have thoughts about that, or can you elaborate on how the message Jesus gave to him on the Damascus Road influenced that part of his theology or his belief of what the body of Christ was or what the church was?
Wow, that's a book length question, I think. It's a really good question.
I had read some stuff by Richard Rohr where he talks about that as being sort of a very organic belief that Paul had about our connection with Christ for believers, I guess, or.
Yeah, it's a very embodied kind of encounter, right? It's a very fleshly one, and it impacts Paul's body and his sight, and it kind of reduces him to being dependent on others in certain kinds of ways. So I'd love to think through those connections that you're making. I've never made them before. It sounds like Richard Rohr's the place to go for that, but I don't have anything blindingly profound to say about it in the moment. That's
it's really
great, though.
influenced my reading of everything else Paul says when I think about that, and then I read Romans or Corinthians or any of those other speeches. It really changes the emphasis, to me it has anyway. I don't know if anyone else feels that way.
Yeah, I think like 2 weeks ago or maybe last week, I recommended the book, The Corinthian Body by Dale Martin, which might be another good place to look, because that's First Corinthians is where Paul really digs into that body of Christ metaphor. And Dale Martin is kind of thinking through, well, where does he get that language? And he's looking to, ancient physicians like Galen, medical texts and things like that to think about how Paul is thinking about the body. And I was going to say, before, that story is told 3 different times in the book of Acts, plus sort of obliquely in the book of Galatians. So it's clearly a central narrative, both for Paul's own understanding of himself and the way other people think Paul thought about himself. So it's worth, I think, understanding, or at least coming to some understanding about what's going on in that passage. Yeah.
I think we all have something to ponder forever now. Thanks, Jeff. But we can't thank you enough, Eric. This has been really enlightening and expanding. And thank you. We'll definitely keep you on our list.
Anytime.
Thank you, one and all, and we'll see you in church. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you,
Thanks, Eric.
Jill.
Thank you, everybody.
You.
Take care.
Thank you.